Welcome to the Sleepy Christian. And tonight we will be talking about Esther, a story of calm courage in the face of fear. Where in the world are you listening from tonight? Whether you're curled up in a quiet bedroom, listening beneath the stars, or drifting off on a quiet night shift, you're in the right place. Let your mind quiet down now as we settle into the beautiful, powerful story of Esther. Imagine a kingdom so vast, it stretched from the mountains of India to the shores of northern Africa. A kingdom where golden palaces rose from the desert, where guards stood in gleaming armor beneath towers that reached into endless skies. This was the Persian Empire, the most powerful in the world, where one man, King Xerxes, ruled over millions. In the heart of it all was the city of Susa, a place of wealth, whispers, and wonder. The air there was thick with the scent of spices and jasmine. Courtyards were lined with marble pillars. Fountains trickled over stones carved with ancient inscriptions. And the palace itself shimmered in the sunlight like a crown resting on the earth. But beneath all that beauty, something was stirring. Something quiet, hidden. A story was beginning that would one day shift the fate of nations. It was the third year of King Xerxes' reign, and he wanted the world to see his glory. So he threw a feast, not just a dinner or a celebration, but a grand, lavish spectacle that lasted 180 days. That's 6 months of endless music, flowing wine, and tables overflowing with food from every corner of the empire. Royal guests traveled from distant lands, dressed in silks and gold, speaking dozens of languages, all gathered under high ceilings embroidered with silver and purple linen. Imagine the torches lit every evening, casting shadows that danced across the walls, the laughter echoing deep into the night. The people of Persia had never seen anything like it. When those 6 months ended, the king wasn't finished. He held another feast, this time for everyone in the city, from the nobles to the servants. For 7 days, the palace garden became a wonderland. White and blue hangings fastened with cords of fine linen, couches of gold and silver, mosaics of alabaster and mother of pearl underfoot. Every guest drank from golden goblets, each one different from the next, and there was no limit to the wine. The king, generous in his pride, wanted his glory to shine like the sun itself. In another part of the palace, Queen Vashti also held a feast for the women. She was strong, proud, and beautiful in her own right, but her story was about to take a turn that would open the door for another, someone whose name the world would never forget. On the 7th day, as the king's heart grew merry with wine, he called for Vashti. He wanted her to appear before the men, wearing her royal crown so that all might gaze upon her beauty. But Vashti refused, a bold act, one that sent a ripple of silence through the palace halls. The king was furious. His advisors, worried that her defiance would encourage women across the empire to follow her example, urged him to remove her as queen. And so, just like that, Vashti was banished. The queen was gone. The throne beside Xerxes sat empty. But in the emptiness, a seed was planted, a vacancy that would lead to a quiet girl named Esther, a girl unknown to kings and kingdoms, raised not in wealth, but in wisdom and faith. Her name wasn't yet spoken in the palace. Her footsteps had not yet echoed in marble halls, but far from the golden throne rooms and royal banquets, her story had already begun. And though no one knew it yet, the God who sees all things was already at work, setting the stage, arranging every detail, and preparing a heart that would one day rise with calm courage in the face of fear. So rest now. Let your thoughts settle into the mystery of ancient days. The story is just beginning, and what comes next will unfold like a tapestry, woven with beauty, risk, faith, and quiet strength. Far from the royal courts and banquet halls of Susa, in the quieter corners of the city where dusty streets wound between stone homes and the sounds of merchants and mothers filled the air, there lived a young girl named Hadassah, but most knew her by her Persian name, Esther. She wasn't born into power or position. She didn't wear jewels or silks. She had no title to her name, no voice in the palace no standing in the great halls of power. She was, to the world, no one special, but the heavens saw her differently. Esther had lost both her parents when she was very young. The ache of that loss, though softened over the years, never fully disappeared. It lived in the quiet moments, in the silence between her prayers, in the weight she sometimes carried in her chest. But she wasn't alone. Her cousin Mordecai had taken her in, raising her as his own daughter. He was a good man, wise, faithful, devoted to God, and steady in character. He served as a minor official in the palace gates, where he heard whispers and watched the changing tides of politics. Yet he always returned home with the same calm spirit, always teaching Esther not just how to survive, but how to walk humbly with wisdom and faith. Their home was modest, yet filled with warmth, the smell of bread baking in the mornings, the glow of oil lamps in the evenings, the quiet reading of sacred words. This was the rhythm of Esther's world. She grew up learning the stories of her people, of Abraham's journey, of Moses' courage, of David's songs in the wilderness. She learned to pray with her heart wide open, to listen for God in silence, to trust in the unseen, even when the world seemed unsteady. And in all this, something deep was forming in her. Not pride, not ambition, but a quiet strength that would one day rise like the morning sun. When word spread through the city that the king had dismissed Queen Vashti and was searching for a new queen, it seemed like something far removed from their lives. It was the sort of talk that belonged to the markets and gossip circles, grand announcements meant for others, never for someone like Esther. But the search wasn't just ceremonial. It was deliberate and sweeping. Royal messengers were sent out across the empire, from the grand cities to the quiet villages. Beautiful young women were gathered from every province, brought to the palace and placed in the care of royal eunuchs. They would be given beauty treatments and instruction, prepared for a single moment in the presence of the king. And so it was that Esther, the orphan girl, was chosen. It must have felt like a dream, or perhaps a strange waking storm. One moment, she was walking the familiar streets of her neighborhood, and the next, she was swept into a world of gold and ritual, perfumes and protocol, expectations and eyes that watched her every move. She entered the palace not with confidence, but with humility. She said little, listened often, and observed everything. And while others sought favor through flattery and pretense, Esther simply remained herself, kind, respectful, gentle in spirit, yet never weak. There was something about her presence, peaceful, steady, gracious, that stood out among the glittering crowd. In the care of Hegai, the official in charge of the women, Esther quickly found unexpected favor. Hegai noticed her immediately, not just for her beauty, but for her spirit. He gave her the best of what was offered, the finest foods, the most comfortable quarters, the most trusted attendants. Yet Esther asked for no excess, requested no special treatment. She moved with grace and a quiet dignity, never forgetting who she was, or whose she was. Mordecai had instructed her not to reveal her heritage, and she obeyed. She held her identity close, like a candle shielded from the wind, knowing there would be a time and place for truth. But that time had not yet come. Each day in the palace was filled with preparation, 12 months of treatments, teachings, and tests. And through it all, Esther remained faithful. She didn't grasp for the crown. She didn't scheme or compete. She simply waited. And the longer she waited, the more her presence left an impression on everyone around her. They couldn't quite name it. It wasn't loud or showy, but it was there, in her voice, her eyes, her silence. When her day finally came to stand before King Xerxes, she asked for nothing more than what Hegai advised. No extra jewelry, no added display. She walked into the throne room as herself, no more, no less. And when the king saw her, something stirred in him, not just admiration, not just desire, but something deeper. In all the beauty he had seen, none had carried themselves like this. Esther found favor in his sight above all the others, and he placed the royal crown upon her head. The orphan girl, the hidden one, had become queen. Yet even in that high position, she did not forget where she came from. She remained in contact with Mordecai, who continued to walk the palace gates. She continued to listen, continued to wait, because deep in her soul, she must have known this story wasn't about crowns or palaces or royal feasts. Something bigger was coming, something darker, and her place in it would matter more than she could yet understand. So let yourself breathe deeply now. Let the thought of a young girl's quiet strength settle into your spirit. She didn't choose the palace, she didn't chase power, but she was placed with purpose, and so perhaps are you. The palace was a world unlike any Esther had ever known. It was a place where every moment was measured, where every word carried weight, and where the smallest gesture could change the course of a life. From the moment she entered those towering gates, she had stepped into an existence shaped by luxury, ritual, and constant attention. Servants moved like shadows through the hallways. Scribes documented every royal order. Courtiers whispered behind fans trimmed with gold, always watching, always judging. The marble floors stretched endlessly, polished to a gleam that reflected the flickering torchlight. Everything glowed: jewels, drapes, mirrors, and skin. And yet, beneath all that beauty, the air was thick with tension, as if the walls themselves were listening. Esther quickly learned that in this place, silence was as valuable as speech, and wisdom often hid in stillness. The women who had been brought to the palace came from every part of the empire. They were daughters of merchants, nobles, landowners, each selected for their beauty, each hoping to catch the eye of the king. And though the public story was dressed in pageantry and honor, everyone knew that this was not a fairy tale. It was a competition, subtle but intense. Behind the laughter and polite conversations, there was pressure to impress, to rise above the rest, to be noticed, chosen, crowned. The preparations were exhaustive. For 12 months, the women were given oils and perfumes, treatments and diets, clothing and counsel. Their days were filled with instruction: how to walk, how to speak, how to behave before the king. Yet no lesson could teach what Esther already carried inside her, a quiet, unshakable grace. She listened more than she spoke. She asked for nothing beyond what was necessary. She was not swayed by vanity or caught up in rivalry. While others adorned themselves with layers of jewels and silks, Esther's beauty came through in her stillness, in the warmth of her presence, in the calm steadiness of her gaze. The other women noticed. Hegai, the royal eunuch responsible for the care of the women, noticed. He gave her special attention, not because she demanded it, but because there was something about her that deserved it. And in time, so did the king. When her moment arrived to appear before Xerxes, Esther did not dress to dazzle. She did not mask herself in finery. She took only what Hegai advised, nothing more. And yet, when she stepped into the royal court, everything seemed to pause. The king's eyes fell on her, and in that instant, there was recognition, not just of beauty, but of something deeper, something rare. He saw her, truly saw her, and his heart inclined toward her. The crown was placed upon her head, and a great feast was declared in her honor. Gifts were distributed throughout the provinces. The people rejoiced at the naming of a new queen. Esther, the orphaned girl from a quiet home in Susa, now stood beside the most powerful man in the world. But even as she wore the crown, she did not let it define her. She remembered Mordecai's words. She remembered her people, her heritage, her faith. She had not revealed that she was a Jew. It wasn't out of shame, it was out of wisdom. There was something unspoken, something sensed, but not yet seen. The time had not come, and so she waited. She remained faithful in silence, alert behind her gentle smile. She watched how decisions were made. She listened to what was spoken in court and what was whispered in corridors. She honored the role she had been given, but she never forgot who she truly was. Her humility did not waver. Her heart did not drift. She did not become lost in the glitter of the throne. Meanwhile, outside the palace gates, Mordecai continued to keep watch. Each day, he would sit near the entrance, scanning the comings and goings, asking after Esther when he could, praying in the quiet spaces of his soul. He still wore the garments of a common man, still kept to his duties, but his spirit remained sharp. He knew that Esther's rise was not by chance. Something larger was unfolding, something only God could orchestrate. And though the path ahead was still hidden in shadows, he trusted that the light would come in its time. One day, as Mordecai sat by the gate, he overheard a plot. Two of the king's guards were speaking in hushed tones, angry and bitter, planning to assassinate Xerxes. Mordecai's heart quickened, but his face remained calm. He moved swiftly, quietly. He got word to Esther, who in turn told the king, giving credit to Mordecai. An investigation was launched. The guards were found guilty and executed. The event was recorded in the royal chronicles, a small note in the grand book of the king's reign. There was no reward, no honor given to Mordecai. Not yet, but heaven does not forget. That single act, so easily overlooked in the moment, would one day turn the course of the entire empire. And Esther, still moving gently through palace life, still holding her secret close, had no idea what lay ahead. She did not yet see the storm forming on the horizon, but she remained steady, still, watchful, chosen. And so the days passed quietly, with purpose unseen. Esther was queen in title, but something far greater was stirring. The true reason for her crown had not yet been revealed. The deeper calling on her life had not yet arrived, but it would. And when it came, the girl who never sought power would rise, not because she desired it, but because she was ready. Let your heart rest here for a while, in the space between what was and what will be, in the stillness of waiting, in the quiet place where God prepares hearts for what only He can see. Esther's story was not finished, and neither is yours. Life in the palace carried on with its usual rhythm, filled with royal decrees, endless banquets, and the constant shifting of power among the king's advisors. But outside those opulent walls, Mordecai remained faithfully at his post near the gates, keeping a quiet eye on the world around him, and staying close enough to hear whispers of courtly news. He was not a man easily moved by fear or vanity. His loyalty to his people and to God shaped everything he did. While others sought favor or advancement, Mordecai's heart was rooted in something far deeper, something the palace walls could neither understand nor shake. It was during these days that a man named Haman began to rise. Haman, an ambitious and cunning figure, clawed his way into the king's favor until he held a position second only to Xerxes himself. His wealth was immense, his power nearly unchecked, and his pride dangerous. The king commanded that all officials and servants bow before Haman as a sign of respect, but Mordecai would not. He could not. His knees belonged only to God. Every day, as Haman passed through the gate, Mordecai stood firm, eyes steady, refusing to bend. And every day, Haman's anger burned hotter. At first, it was a small irritation, a bruise to his ego. But Haman was not a man to let go of grudges. Soon that irritation grew into hatred, and that hatred grew into a plan, not just to punish Mordecai, but to wipe out all of Mordecai's people. Haman wanted revenge that would shake the entire Jewish nation, a cruelty born from pride and bitterness. He went to the king with a cunning lie. "There are certain people," Haman said, "scattered throughout the provinces of your kingdom, who keep themselves separate. Their laws are different from those of every other people, and they do not obey the king's laws. It is not in the king's best interest to tolerate them." His words were coated with deceit, dripping with poison. And then came his proposal. Destroy them all. He offered a fortune of silver to the royal treasury to carry out this plan. Xerxes, perhaps distracted or unconcerned, gave Haman his signet ring, the symbol of authority, and told him to do as he pleased. Just like that, the fate of an entire people hung on the whims of one man's pride. Haman wasted no time. Scribes were summoned. A decree was written in every language of the empire. sealed with the king's ring and sent by swift messengers to every province. The decree was chillingly clear. On the 13th day of the 12th month, every Jew, young and old, men and women, was to be killed. Their possessions would be plundered. It was a death sentence, signed and sealed under royal authority. As the messengers galloped out of Susa, carrying this message of death, fear rippled through the land like a cold wind. When the news reached the Jewish community, their hearts broke. In homes and markets and city streets, there was weeping, fasting, mourning. Sorrow hung over the people like a heavy, dark cloud. Mordecai's reaction was immediate and fierce. He tore his clothes, exchanged them for rough sackcloth, and covered his head with ashes. A public sign of grief and repentance, he walked through the streets of Susa, crying out with a loud and bitter wail. This was not a quiet sorrow hidden behind closed doors. This was a cry that reached heaven itself. He stationed himself at the king's gate, still dressed in sackcloth, but no one in mourning garments was allowed to enter the palace. Word of Mordecai's distress reached Esther through her attendants. She was troubled, confused, and sent fresh clothes for him, but he refused to wear them. There was no time for comfort when death loomed over their people. Through a messenger named Hathach, Mordecai explained everything. He sent Esther a copy of the decree and pleaded with her to go before the king, to beg for mercy and plead for her people. But Esther's heart trembled. She knew the law. No one, man or woman, could approach the king in his inner court without being summoned. To do so was to invite death, unless the king extended his golden scepter in mercy, and for 30 days, she had not been called to see him. Fear pressed in on her like a shadow, yet Mordecai's reply was firm, unforgettable. Do not think that because you are in the king's house, you alone will escape. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place. But you and your family will perish. And who knows, perhaps you were made queen for such a time as this. Those words settled deep into Esther's heart like a steady flame, quiet but unshakable. It was as if the entire course of her life, her losses, her journey, her hidden identity, had led to this one moment. A moment where fear and courage would stand face to face. A moment where silence could no longer hold. She knew then that the time for waiting was over. Something had to be done. Something bold, dangerous, and entirely beyond her strength alone. Yet in her heart, she also knew this. She was not alone. As night fell over Susa, the city stirred with whispers of dread and uncertainty. But in Esther's chambers, a decision was being made, one that would change everything. She sent word back to Mordecai, her voice steady now. Go, gather all the Jews in Susa, fast for me, do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. My attendants and I will fast as well. And when this is done, I will go to the king, even though it is against the law. And if I perish, I perish. With those words, the first sparks of courage began to rise. It was the kind of courage that doesn't roar but whispers, the kind that grows in silence and fasting, the kind that blooms in trust rather than certainty. The days ahead would be heavy, filled with waiting and prayer, as Esther prepared for what might be her final act. Mordecai too stood resolute, his sackcloth a reminder that though they were powerless before the king of Persia, they were not powerless before the king of heaven. And in those quiet, desperate hours, the story that began in the humble streets of Susa and moved into the golden halls of the palace was about to turn, guided by a hand that neither palace walls nor royal decrees could ever contain. Darkness seemed to settle over the city as news of the decree rippled outward. People spoke in hushed voices, gathering in small clusters behind closed doors, hearts pounding with fear for their children, their parents, their future. The ordinary hum of life was replaced by the sound of weeping, the rustle of sackcloth, the haunting silence of hope nearly lost. Shops closed early. Laughter vanished from the streets. In the markets, the voices of merchants and buyers grew quiet as news spread, every eye glancing over shoulders, every heart heavy with dread. Those who had once felt safe in their routines now looked to the horizon with uncertainty, counting the days until the appointed time of destruction. Inside the palace, Esther's world had narrowed to a single thought. What could she do? She moved through her chambers like a shadow, her attendants watching her with concern, their eyes filled with silent questions. They too had heard the whispers. They knew something terrible was coming, and they could see the weight settling onto Esther's shoulders. The luxury and comfort of her new life now seemed small and distant, unable to keep the cold fear at bay. She had once lived as a girl with little power, but now she held a fragile, dangerous influence. She understood what it meant to be afraid, to feel the pulse of risk in her veins. And yet, she also remembered Mordecai's words. Words that did not release her from responsibility. Words that told her she was exactly where she was meant to be, for reasons she could not yet see. The laws of Persia were immovable, carved in stone and guarded by tradition. No one, not even the queen, could enter the inner court of the king without an invitation. To approach was to risk everything. The stories of those who had disobeyed were well known. Even royalty was not spared. If the king was displeased, he had only to remain silent, and the guards would remove the offender forever. The only hope was the golden scepter, extended in rare mercy by the king himself. Esther's heart raced every time she thought of it. Days had passed since Xerxes had summoned her. She knew she had no guarantees, no special protection, no promise that her life would be spared if she dared to break the law. The fear in her heart was real and deep. She walked the palace gardens, hands trembling, mind filled with images of her people, faces she remembered from childhood, elders who had whispered blessings over her, children who played in the streets of Susa, all now living in the shadow of death. Could she risk everything for them? If she spoke and failed, she would perish and still lose everything she loved. If she stayed silent, she might be spared for a moment, but would surely lose herself. It was a choice between comfort and calling, safety and sacrifice. The burden pressed against her soul, yet in that darkness, a quiet resolve began to grow. She sent word to Mordecai, asking him to gather all the Jews of Susa to fast for her. No food, no drink, for 3 days and nights. She and her attendants would do the same. Fasting was more than an act of desperation. It was a declaration of dependence. In their hunger and thirst, they turned their hearts to God, seeking wisdom, mercy, and courage that could not come from within themselves. It was a time of waiting in the dark, listening for the faintest whisper of hope. For 3 days, the city held its breath. Esther's heart beat slow and steady, counting each hour, each prayer, each longing for the strength to do what must be done. The city outside remained restless, shadows gathering in the alleys and doorways. Children cried softly in the night as their parents clung to them, uncertain of what tomorrow would bring. In the homes of the Jews, ancient prayers rose on trembling voices, filling the night air with longing and trust. Prayers that God would remember them, that He would deliver them, that somehow, some way, the tide would turn. In the silence, Esther felt herself being held, not by her title or her position, but by something deeper, a promise that she was not alone, even as she stood on the edge of the unknown. The morning of the 3rd day dawned pale and still, the sun struggling to break through the heavy clouds. Esther rose, her face calm, her decision made. She dressed in her royal robes, each fold a reminder of her calling, each jewel a silent promise of the lives depending on her. Her attendants watched in awe as she prepared, sensing the holy weight of her mission. With one last, lingering prayer, she stepped from her chambers and walked slowly toward the king's hall, every step echoing with both fear and faith. She did not know if she would survive the day. She only knew she could not remain silent. The plan was set in motion, a dangerous plan with everything at stake. And as Esther crossed the threshold, all of heaven leaned in to watch. For 3 days and nights, a hush fell over Susa, as prayers and quiet hope filled the empty spaces. Esther and her attendants fasted, neither eating nor drinking, their hearts and minds turned toward God. In humble homes across the city, families gathered, united in silence, their tears and prayers mingling with the shadows. The city, once so vibrant with commerce and music, seemed to slow and hold its breath. The weight of uncertainty pressed down, but in that stillness, something unseen was taking root, a kind of courage that grows in darkness, a strength born not of self, but of surrender. Every moment Esther waited, the urgency built within her. She thought of Mordecai, her only family, sitting outside the palace gates in sackcloth and ashes, refusing comfort while his people faced ruin. She thought of her ancestors, of Sarah's faith, of Moses' bravery, of David's trust. All their stories seemed to gather now, whispering to her heart that courage is never the absence of fear, but the willingness to act in spite of it. On the morning of the third day, Esther stood and let her attendants dress her in royal robes, the fabric heavy with gold thread, soft against her skin, cool and unfamiliar. Each movement was deliberate, every fold a reminder of the journey she had taken to reach this moment. As she looked at her reflection, she saw not only a queen, but a daughter of her people, standing on the threshold of sacrifice. Her hands were steady, her eyes bright, her heart still pounding with uncertainty. But there was resolve now, a quiet flame that would not be extinguished by fear. The walk to the king's hall was long. Every step echoed on polished stone, reverberating through corridors lined with tall pillars and delicate carvings. She passed guards who bowed low, attendants who paused and watched, uncertain of her purpose. The scent of lilies drifted through open windows, carried by a gentle breeze that seemed to whisper a blessing just for her. As she neared the throne room, her thoughts quieted. The law was clear. No one, not even the queen, could enter without a summons. Guards watched her closely, hands on their weapons, eyes cold and unreadable. Esther felt the risk of every heartbeat, knowing she might not return. Yet she pressed on, her footsteps unwavering. Beyond the towering doors, King Xerxes sat on his throne, surrounded by officials and courtiers. Light filtered down through high windows, catching the gold of his robe and the jewels of his crown. The hall was silent as Esther appeared in the doorway, her figure graceful and regal, yet so small compared to the grand room. Time seemed to stretch and slow, the moment hanging like a fragile thread. Every eye turned to her. The king looked up, his face unreadable. Esther stood, silent and still, her entire life balanced on the next breath. A hush fell over the court. Would the king extend mercy or turn away? Would he remember her kindness or be ruled by pride and law? With a slow, deliberate motion, King Xerxes reached for the golden scepter in his hand and extended it toward Esther, its gleam bright and unmistakable. Relief swept over her like a sudden wave. She stepped forward, touching the tip of the scepter, a gesture that meant her life would be spared. The king's voice broke the silence, warm with curiosity. "What is it, Queen Esther? What do you wish? Even up to half the kingdom, it will be given to you." But Esther did not rush into her request. She had learned the wisdom of patience, the power of timing. Instead, she invited the king and Haman to a banquet she would prepare that very day. There was a ripple of surprise, but the king accepted, intrigued by her mysterious calm. Haman, flushed with pride, was thrilled to be singled out. He left the palace that day brimming with self-importance, oblivious to the deeper currents shifting beneath the surface. Esther, meanwhile, returned to her chambers, her mind sharp and focused. She prayed for strength and clarity. She knew the battle was not won in a single moment, but in a series of small, faithful steps. That night, as the palace prepared for the feast, Esther found herself standing in the midst of a story much greater than her own. She was not only risking her life for her people, but for something deeper, a testimony to faith in the unseen, a reminder that courage and wisdom often walk hand in hand. Haman, so certain of his power, had no idea that his own pride was setting a trap at his feet. Mordecai, still in sackcloth, continued to pray outside the gates, not knowing the part he would play in the days to come. As evening fell and golden lamps were lit throughout the palace, the first banquet began. Esther welcomed the king and Haman, her presence serene and gracious. Food and wine were served. Music played softly in the background, but beneath it all, there was a sense of anticipation. Something important was about to unfold. The king, curious, asked again about her request, but Esther answered with a second invitation. Come to another banquet tomorrow. There was purpose in her patience, a sense that the timing was not yet right. In the quiet of her chambers that night, Esther lay awake, her mind and heart still before God. She remembered the prayers of her people, the promise she carried, and the hope that no decree, no matter how cruel, could silence faith. In the darkness, she whispered her fears, and in that silence, found a peace that surpasses understanding. All around her, the world slept, but heaven was wide awake, guiding her every step, weaving together threads of courage, wisdom, and trust for such a time as this. The evening air in Susa was thick with the scent of spices, as the palace was quietly transformed for Esther's banquet. Lanterns flickered against walls in patterns of gold and shadow, their glow gentle and soothing, while the finest silks draped across tables set with dishes from distant provinces. Everything was perfect, yet beneath the beauty and warmth, a deeper tension lingered. This night was more than a simple feast. It was a moment of pause between fear and revelation, a breath drawn in the center of a storm. Esther welcomed the king and Haman with a grace that masked the turmoil within her. She moved with calm assurance, yet her heart thudded quietly with every step and word, knowing that every moment counted. The three of them sat together, sharing food and laughter, each for their own reasons. Esther in patient waiting and careful planning, the king in curiosity and affection, Haman in the arrogant joy of being singled out for royal favor. To the casual observer, this was an ordinary evening, but Esther knew the true purpose was still hidden. There was wisdom in waiting. She sensed that the right words, spoken too soon, might drift away like dust on the wind. And so, when the king leaned forward and asked, "What is your request? Whatever you desire, even up to half the kingdom, it shall be given you," Esther smiled and spoke gently. "If it pleases the king, let the king and Haman come tomorrow to the banquet I will prepare. Then I will answer the king's question." The king agreed, his curiosity deepening, while Haman left the feast feeling more powerful than ever. As he walked through the palace gates, pride swelled in his heart. He was the honored guest of queen and king alike, his name spoken with respect, his future seemingly as bright as the palace itself. Yet, just as he passed, he saw Mordecai still standing by the gate, refusing to bow. In that moment, all of Haman's joy curdled into rage. The honor of the queen meant nothing to him if one man would not kneel. He went home, filled with fury, and gathered his friends and family. He boasted of his wealth, his children, and the special treatment he'd received from the king and queen, but none of it satisfied him. He complained, "All this gives me no satisfaction as long as I see Mordecai the Jew sitting at the king's gate." His wife and friends, eager to please him, suggested a cruel plan. Build a gallows 75 feet high and ask the king to have Mordecai hanged on it. Haman was delighted. He gave the order at once, certain that tomorrow his enemies would be beneath his feet. But while Haman plotted vengeance, something mysterious stirred within the palace. That very night, the king found himself unable to sleep. He tossed and turned on his silken sheets, restless and uneasy. In the quiet darkness, he summoned his attendants and ordered that the royal records be brought and read aloud, a way to fill the empty hours and perhaps settle his mind. As the chronicles were read, the story surfaced of how Mordecai had uncovered the plot to assassinate the king, saving Xerxes' life. The king paused. "What honor or reward has Mordecai received for this?" he asked. The answer came back. Nothing had been done. A strange turn of fate, silent until now, was beginning to weave a new path. With dawn barely breaking, Haman entered the court, eager to ask the king for permission to execute Mordecai, but before he could speak, Xerxes called him in. "What should be done for the man the king delights to honor?" the king asked. Haman, swelling with pride, assumed the honor must be for him. He imagined the grandeur, robes the king had worn, a horse the king had ridden, a parade through the city with someone proclaiming the king's favor. He described this vision in detail, his own pride painting the picture. To his shock, the king said, "Go at once, get the robe and the horse, and do just as you have suggested for Mordecai the Jew, who sits at the king's gate. Do not neglect anything you have recommended." The humiliation was swift and sharp. Haman was forced to dress Mordecai in royal robes, to lead him through the city, announcing before all, "This is what is done for the man the king delights to honor." Every step burned with shame. The people watched, some amazed, some joyful, as the tide turned in a single morning. When it was over, Mordecai returned to his place at the gate, silent but steadfast, while Haman hurried home in grief and rage. He covered his head, mourning the beginning of his fall. His family saw the signs and warned him, "If Mordecai, before whom your downfall has started, is of Jewish origin, you cannot stand against him. You will surely come to ruin." Even as Haman tried to process this reversal, the king's messengers arrived, hurrying him off to the second banquet. The day was not yet done, the story not yet told. Esther waited in her chambers, praying for strength and timing, knowing that the next few moments would decide everything. The future of her people, the plans of her enemies, the fate of a nation, all would turn on a feast, a confession, and the courage to finally speak. The palace, with all its glitter and noise, was poised on the edge of something miraculous, a reversal that no one could have predicted, but that heaven had been preparing all along. And as the sun set on that extraordinary day, the pieces were falling quietly into place. As the palace's golden lamps glowed through the gathering dusk, a sense of anticipation swept through its corridors. The second banquet was upon them, and though the musicians played and servants whispered, there was a quiet urgency in the air, a sense that everything was about to change. Esther moved through her chambers with a calm born not of certainty, but of trust. Each step was measured, every movement wrapped in prayer. The hall was set for the feast, and she took her place, her heart steady and strong, waiting for the right moment to speak the truth that would break through the darkness. King Xerxes arrived, his curiosity sharpened by the events of the day. Haman entered too, but the confidence he had worn like a cloak was gone, replaced by unease and confusion. He could not shake the bitter humiliation of having honored Mordecai, the man he most despised, and there was a coldness in his bones as he sat at the queen's table. Still, he clung to hope. Perhaps this second invitation was a sign of favor. Perhaps things would turn in his direction once again. The meal unfolded slowly, with food and wine passed from hand to hand, and then the king turned to Esther, his eyes filled with expectation. "Queen Esther," he asked again, "what is your petition? It will be given you. What is your request? Even up to half the kingdom, it will be granted." There was a hush in the room as all waited for her answer, the weight of silence stretching long and thin. Esther's voice was gentle but clear as she spoke, her words trembling with the truth that had been hidden for so long. "If I have found favor with you, your majesty, and if it pleases you, grant me my life. This is my petition, and spare my people. This is my request. For I and my people have been sold to be destroyed, killed, and annihilated. If we had been sold merely as slaves, I would have kept silent, but our very lives are at stake." The king's eyes widened in shock and anger. Who is he? Where is the man who has dared to do such a thing? Esther turned, her courage unwavering, and spoke the name that had poisoned so many hearts. "Our adversary and enemy is this vile Haman." The moment seemed to freeze in the air, the silence ringing like a bell. Haman's face turned pale. The king, enraged, rose from the table, and stormed out into the palace gardens, his thoughts a whirlwind of betrayal and confusion. Haman, left behind, realized the walls were closing in. In desperation, he fell before Esther, pleading for his life, his pride and cruelty now stripped away, leaving only fear. As the king returned, he saw Haman falling onto the couch where Esther reclined, and his fury only deepened. "Will he even assault the queen while she is with me in the house?" the king shouted, his anger echoing through the halls. At that signal, servants rushed forward and covered Haman's face, marking the end of his power. One of the king's attendants, Harbona, spoke up. "A gallows 75 feet high stands by Haman's house. He had it built for Mordecai, who spoke up to help the king. Xerxes, not hesitating, ordered, 'Hang him on it.' And so Haman's life ended on the very gallows he had built for another, his cruelty and pride brought to justice in a single sudden stroke. The king's wrath cooled, and he gave Esther Haman's entire estate. Mordecai was summoned, and Esther revealed his true relationship to her. In a single day, everything was reversed. Mordecai, once dressed in sackcloth and ashes outside the palace gates, now wore the king's signet ring and the robes of honor. He was placed in charge of Haman's house, and his wisdom was finally recognized by all who had watched him walk in humility and faith. Yet, the threat to Esther's people remained. The decree for their destruction still hung over them, sealed with the king's own ring, unbreakable according to Persian law. Despair mixed with hope, for while their enemy was gone, the danger had not yet passed. Esther fell at the king's feet, weeping and pleading for her people. Xerxes extended his golden scepter once more, inviting her to rise and speak. She begged him to issue another decree to counter the one written by Haman and save her people from destruction. The king agreed, giving Mordecai and Esther the authority to write a new edict in the name of the king and seal it with the royal ring. Scribes were summoned again, and Mordecai dictated the message. Throughout all the provinces of Persia, a new law was sent forth. The Jews were given the right to assemble, to protect themselves, to defend their lives against any who would attack them. The king's messengers rode out at once, carrying hope and deliverance to every corner of the empire. Joy and relief began to ripple through the land, breaking through the sorrow and fear that had settled like a shadow over so many hearts. In Susa, the Jews celebrated with feasts and gladness, and many from other nations saw what had happened and joined in their joy. Mordecai left the king's presence dressed in royal blue and white, a golden crown upon his head, honored at last by all who saw him. The tables had turned. What began as a plan for destruction ended in a victory so complete that even the darkest night could not erase its light. Esther had spoken, Mordecai had acted, and the hand of God had moved quietly, surely, through every moment, through fasting and fear, through courage and confession, through a banquet that became the turning point for a nation. The palace, once filled with the schemes of the proud, now echoed with laughter and thanksgiving. The promise of deliverance bright as dawn. Those who had been silenced found their voices. Those who had mourned found comfort. The day of disaster was transformed into a day of celebration, and the legacy of courage and faith began to spread far beyond the walls of Susa, into every home and heart, willing to remember that no decree is stronger than hope, and no darkness can overcome the light of truth. Across the vast lands of Persia, from the green hills of the west to the desert sands of the east, messengers rode through the night, their horses' hooves pounding out a rhythm of hope. The new decree, sealed with the king's ring, was read in every province, in every city, in every tongue. Word spread swiftly. What had once been a sentence of doom was now a call to courage and self-defense. The Jewish people, once silenced by fear and weighted with mourning, were suddenly given the right to stand and protect themselves, to gather together, to turn the tide against anyone who might seek their harm. Where dread had pressed in, a new sense of unity began to grow. Families who had wept together now held one another a little closer, finding strength not only in the law, but in the presence of God, who had been with them through every shadow. In the city of Susa, the mood shifted palpably. The sound of lamentation faded, replaced by the whispers of hope and the beginnings of celebration. Mordecai walked through the streets, now not as an outcast, but as a man honored by the king, clothed in garments of blue and white, a golden crown resting lightly on his brow. Those who had once passed him by now looked with respect, remembering his faithfulness and courage. Esther, the quiet queen, became the heart of the city's hope, her bravery told and retold among mothers and children, the story echoing in doorways and around tables where candles burned through the night in prayer and gratitude. The day appointed for destruction finally arrived, but it dawned not with tears, but with determination. The enemies of the Jews had prepared to attack, confident that the old decree would give them victory, but they found a people united and strong, standing side by side. Those who sought harm were overcome, and the people defended themselves with the authority the king had granted. All across the empire, from the bustling capital to the farthest villages, sorrow was turned to gladness, trembling replaced by songs of deliverance. Even those outside the Jewish faith marveled at what had happened and honored the God who protected his people. As news of deliverance spread, the days of mourning gave way to feasting and joy. The Jewish people rejoiced, sending gifts to one another, caring for the poor, gathering in celebration of their survival and their newfound security. It was a time not just to remember the fear, but to remember the faithfulness that had carried them through. Every meal shared was a testimony, every embrace a promise that no power on earth could erase the hope placed in their hearts. Old men recalled their days of exile and wept tears of relief. Children ran through the streets with laughter, wearing ribbons of blue and white, their voices rising with songs of thanks. Mothers and fathers breathed easy for the first time in months, holding each other close, blessing the names of Esther and Mordecai with every grateful word. In the palace, Esther looked out over the city, seeing the lights of countless homes where families were safe because she had chosen to speak. She felt the deep peace that comes only after a long night of fear. The assurance that her courage had mattered not just for herself, but for a nation. She remembered the days of fasting and trembling, the silent prayers in her room, the heaviness she had carried on behalf of so many. Now that burden was lifted, replaced by joy, a quiet, lasting joy that ran deeper than words. And Mordecai, once the watchman at the gate, was now second only to the king, using his influence not for pride or revenge, but for justice, wisdom, and the good of all the people. He led with humility, honoring God in every decision, remembering always that it was faith, not power, that had brought deliverance. The festival of Purim was established on those very days, a celebration marked by laughter and sharing, gifts exchanged between friends and strangers, food given freely to those in need. It was a festival not born from victory in battle, but from a victory of hope and the faithfulness of a God who works in quiet, hidden way. Year after year, generation after generation, the people remembered. They told the story of the queen who spoke when silence was easier, the cousin who stood firm when others bowed, the God who saved when all seemed lost. In the gentle glow of candles and the warmth of shared meals, they taught their children that darkness is never the end, that courage is never wasted, that faith can turn even the most fearful decree into a song of freedom. So the empire settled into peace once more, the echoes of fear replaced by the steady rhythm of celebration. In every home, in every heart, there was a quiet recognition that God's purposes can weave through the most unlikely of lives and the most ordinary of days. The Jews of Persia rested, not in their own strength, but in the sure knowledge that they were seen, remembered, and loved. And as the sun set on that first Purim, laughter drifted over the city, rising above rooftops and palaces, carrying a message of hope for anyone who would listen. There is always light on the other side of the longest night. In the gentle days that followed, peace settled softly over the city of Susa and far beyond, seeping into every corner of the vast Persian Empire. The hurried footsteps of messengers faded, replaced by the slower, quieter rhythms of ordinary life. meals shared at crowded tables, laughter echoing through open windows, prayers spoken at dawn and dusk with voices no longer heavy with fear. In Jewish homes, the memory of deliverance became as real and vital as the bread on their tables or the warm embrace of a loved one. The shadow that once loomed had vanished, swept away by a victory that belonged to everyone, not just the powerful or the brave, but to every mother, father, child, and neighbor who had held on to hope in the darkest of hours. Esther, whose name meant star, became a symbol of light in the memory of her people. Her story, once whispered in secret, was now sung aloud in marketplaces, taught to children at bedtime, spoken of with gratitude and awe. She'd never wanted a throne, never sought the weight of a crown, yet when the moment came, she did not shrink back. Her courage was not thunderous, not the kind that shouted from rooftops or demanded applause. It was quiet and steady, a resolve that grew in secret, in silence, in prayer. She'd been afraid, uncertain, even trembling, yet she had stepped forward anyway, trusting that her life had purpose beyond what she could see. Now, as the city thrived around her, she found peace in the knowledge that every choice, every risk, every whispered prayer had not been in vain. Mordecai too found his place in the new world that had blossomed from so much sorrow. No longer just a watcher at the gate, he became a leader in the kingdom, honored and respected by all. Yet he remained humble, never forgetting the road he had walked or the God who had answered in their time of need. He used his influence to bring peace and justice, working for the good of all people, not just his own. His wisdom became a blessing to the entire empire. He walked through the city each morning, his eyes meeting those of friends and strangers alike. His presence a reminder that faithfulness in small things can change the world in ways no one expects. And so, each year, as winter faded and the first signs of spring appeared, the Jewish people set aside days for the festival of Purim, a festival not just of survival, but of transformation. It was a time for feasting and gifts, for sharing with the poor, for laughter and remembering. Children dressed up in costumes, stories were told and retold, and the scroll of Esther was read aloud so that no one would ever forget the courage and deliverance that had come in the days of uncertainty. In every retelling, new generations learned that even in exile, even under threat, even when all hope seems lost, God can work through the humble, the fearful, the overlooked, weaving redemption through lives willing to trust Him. The festival was not simply a command or an obligation. It became a pulse of joy, a melody running beneath everyday life, a time for letting go of old wounds and embracing the good that had come out of pain. Neighbors who once grieved together now danced in the streets, their faces shining in the lamplight, sharing sweet pastries and wine. In the quiet corners of each home, blessings were spoken over food and family, over the young and the old, over friends and strangers alike. Those who had once known only sorrow found themselves laughing, amazed at the healing that time and faith could bring. But the heart of the story was never just about kings and queens, palaces or decrees. It was about ordinary people made extraordinary by faith. A girl who risked everything because she could not bear to see her people destroyed. A man who stood steadfast when others bowed. A community that fasted and prayed together in the night and woke to joy in the morning. It was a story about how the smallest light can scatter the deepest darkness, how a single act of courage can change the fate of thousands. And perhaps, most of all, it was a reminder that every life, no matter how hidden or humble, has purpose and meaning, woven by a loving hand into a much greater tapestry. As the last notes of celebration faded and night settled gently over the city, the story of Esther remained, a beacon for every generation that would come after. Her legacy whispered to all who faced fear or uncertainty, "You are not alone. Your courage matters. Your prayers are heard. For such a time as this, you have been placed right where you are." The God who answered in Susa is the same God who listens still, watching over each life, working quietly in the background, turning mourning into joy and fear into faith. So, as you drift off to sleep tonight, let this story rest in your heart. The story of a star who shone in darkness and a people who found rest at last. In every season, may you remember that hope endures, peace is possible, and you are never forgotten. The night is never as long as it seems. The morning is already on its way.